I want you to picture a cathedral. Not of stone and stained glass, but of steel and fluorescence. A place we build not to worship a god, but to beg one for more time. I walked its halls every day. I believed in its promise. I believed that behind those automatic doors, science had built a fortress against the dark. But fortresses can fall from within. It started quietly, a monitor that beeped a second too late. A nurse who apologized because there was no one else to hold the patient's hand. Small things, things you could explain away. But horror does not arrive with a shriek. It arrives with a shrug. With a tired sigh, with the sound of a doctor saying, "We don't have a bed," and meaning, "We don't have a chance." I saw a man die in a hallway. Not because the machines failed. Not because the surgeon lacked skill. But because there was no one to wheel him into the room. He bled out on linoleum while, 3 feet away, a computer screen glowed with his empty chart. And the staff kept walking. That is the part that will stay with me longer than any code blue. Not the chaos, but the quiet. The way we learned to step over the crack in the foundation. The way we stopped saying, "This is wrong," and started saying, "This is Tuesday." You want to know what terrified me? It wasn't the dying. It was watching good people unlearn how to be shocked. It was watching a system designed to heal become a machine that simply processes. It was realizing that the machine doesn't care if you're on the table or under it. I am telling you this not because I want you to be afraid of the hospital. I am telling you because the hospital is not the source. The hospital is the mirror. And what I saw in that reflection is that we've already accepted the terms. We've agreed that this is how it has to be. But it isn't. It never was. The door is still open. The question is whether we walk through it, or whether we keep pretending that the cathedral isn't burning. Picture a cathedral. Not the kind carved from ancient stone, where light filters through rose windows and dust dances in the silence. This cathedral is built of glass and steel, rising from the asphalt like a monument to human mastery. You approach it and feel smaller. The automatic doors part not with a creak but with a whisper, and you step inside believing, truly believing, that you have entered a place where death is kept waiting in the lobby. That is the first deception. That is the false cathedral. We construct these buildings to inspire awe, and they succeed. The polished floors reflect the fluorescent lights until the hallway stretches into infinity. The nurses move in soft shoes, their voices low, their uniforms crisp. The machines blink in quiet rhythm, each beep a promise that someone is watching, that someone knows. The waiting areas are designed with muted colors and calming prints because the architects understand, fear must be soothed before it can be treated. So we build sanctuaries. We call them medical centers. We call them healing environments. We bless them with ribbon cuttings and dedicate wings to donors whose names are cast in bronze. But a cathedral is not holy because of its arches. It is holy because of what it contains. And here, in this place we have sanctified with our tax dollars and our desperate faith, the sacred is quietly being removed. I walked those halls in my white coat, and for years I did not see it. I was inside the cathedral. I was part of its liturgy. I believed that the equipment would be there because it was always there. I believed that the hands would arrive because they always arrived. I believed that the building itself, its very walls, held some protective power. This was the hospital. This was where sickness ended. This was where the world paused so that a person could be saved. But cathedrals do not save anyone. Cathedrals are just rooms. And rooms, no matter how well lit, no matter how clean, are only as sacred as the people who inhabit them. The false promise of the hospital is that its architecture guarantees its mission. We look at the helipad and assume the cavalry is coming. We look at the MRI machine and assume salvation has already been invented. We look at the badge around the doctor's neck and assume wisdom lives there. But the building does not heal. The machine does not decide. The badge is just laminated plastic. We have poured our faith into concrete and circuitry, and we have mistaken the vessel for the prayer. The true terror is not that the cathedral is collapsing. It is that the cathedral was never strong enough to hold what we asked of it. We asked it to be immune to budget cuts. We asked it to function without rest. We asked it to absorb every wound, every virus, every failing organ, and to return the patient to us whole. And the cathedral, this beautiful, gleaming structure of evidence-based design and HEPA filtration, it nodded silently. It accepted our worship. It never told us it was just a shell. I remember standing at the nurse's station during a night shift, the building humming around me, and realizing that I could not remember the last time I looked up at the ceiling and felt awe. The awe was gone. It had been replaced by something thinner, something that sounded like resignation. The cathedral was still beautiful. The light still fell through the windows in the atrium. But the god had already left. The first crack never announces itself. There is no alarm, no overhead page, no moment when a voice breaks through the intercom to say, something here has begun to fail. It arrives in the small spaces. It arrives in the pause between heartbeats on a monitor. It arrives in the way a nurse's eyes drop to the floor before she answers a question. I saw it on a Tuesday. 3 in the afternoon. A patient in room 4 needed a medication that required a pump. Not a rare medication. Not a complex pump. Just the ordinary machinery of modern medicine, the kind we take for granted the way we take for granted that the lights will turn on. But the pump was not there. It had been taken. It had not been returned. And the nurse, competent, experienced, the kind of nurse who had saved lives before breakfast, she did not curse. She did not call for help. She simply stood there, one hand on the rail of the bed, and she was quiet. Then she walked to the supply closet and wrote her name on a waiting list. A waiting list. For a pump. That was the first crack. Not the missing equipment. Not the delay in care. But the waiting list. The acceptance. The quiet mathematics of scarcity that had crept into the room and sat down like a visitor who intends to stay. You tell yourself it is an anomaly. You tell yourself the supply will catch up, the staff will arrive, the system will absorb this small disruption and correct itself. You tell yourself this because the alternative, that the machine is beginning to stutter, is too large to hold. So you do not hold it. You set it down. You pick up the next chart. But the cracks do not seal. They multiply. A chair appears in the hallway. Then another. Patients who would have been in beds are now in chairs, and the chairs are in the corridor, and the corridor was never designed for sleep. A doctor orders a CT scan, and the transport team says, 45 minutes. Not because the scanner is broken. Because there is one person to move 20 patients. Because the other transporter called in sick and no one was hired to replace her. Because attrition is just another word for bleeding out slowly. The crack spread into conversation. You hear it in the break room, not shouted but murmured, we are running out of ICU beds. We are running out of oxygen tubing. We are running out of night shift nurses and the agency can't send anyone until next week. Each sentence is a hairline fracture. Each fracture weakens the load-bearing wall. But no one calls for an evacuation. No one marks the building unsafe. Because the building is still standing. Because the patients are still arriving. Because the alternative to pretending is admitting that we have been pretending for months, maybe years, and no one came to fix it. I remember a code blue called on a medical floor. The team rushed in. The airway was secured. The medications were pushed. And after it was over, after the patient's rhythm returned and the room exhaled, the attending physician looked at the cardiac monitor and said, quietly, almost to himself, that defibrillator should have charged faster. It was 3 seconds. 3 seconds between the button and the shock. 3 seconds that no one noticed except the man who knew, down to the millisecond, how long his tool should take. He did not report it. There was no one to report it to. The biomed team was backed up 2 weeks. The replacement would take a month to approve. So he documented the time, and he moved on. The machine stayed. The crack stayed with it. This is how the fall begins. Not with a collapse. Not with a catastrophe that makes the evening news. It begins with a pump that is not there. A chair in a hallway. A defibrillator that hesitates. It begins with good people learning to expect less, to request instead of demand, to say thank you when the bare minimum arrives. It begins with silence. And the silence spreads, floor by floor, until the whole cathedral is standing on faith alone, and faith, unlike steel, has a breaking point. The slow bleed is the hardest to see because it never pools. It never stains the floor. It simply seeps, drop by drop, until one day you look down and realize you have been standing in it for hours and never noticed the wetness seeping through your shoes. This is how a hospital dies. Not in the dramatic arrest, not in the code called too late, but in the thousand small decisions that begin with, we have to prioritize, and end with, there was nothing else we could do. I watched a senior nurse calculate ratios on a scrap of paper during morning huddle. Not because she was instructed to. Because her mind, trained over 2 decades to assess and respond, had learned a new reflex, dividing the number of patients by the number of bodies. She did it without looking at the paper. Her pen moved. Her lips barely stirred. 18 patients. 2 nurses. One of the nurses was floated from pediatrics and had not touched an adult IV in 3 years. The math was not hopeful. But the math was not the story. The story was what came next. The story was the reassignment, the quiet redistribution of acuity, the decision that Mr. Garcia in 312 could wait another hour for his pain medication because Mrs. Kai in 308 was desaturating. Not because Mr. Garcia mattered less. Because there were only 2 hands and the clock would not slow down. This is the slow bleed. It is the exhaustion that accumulates like a debt that can never be repaid. It is the 12-hour shift that becomes 13, then 14, because the night shift is short and the patient in 317 is circling the drain and you cannot hand off a crashing patient to a nurse who already has 6. It is the meal you forget to eat, the water you forget to drink, the bathroom break you forget to take until your bladder is a dull throb you have learned to ignore. It is the moment you realize you have not sat down in 8 hours and your back is no longer complaining because it has given up. The slow bleed lives in the rationing. Not of ventilators or ICU beds, those make headlines. It lives in the rationing of attention, of time, of the small dignities that once defined care. It lives in the conversation you do not have time to finish. The hand you do not have time to hold. The family you cannot find because the social worker was laid off and discharge planning now falls to a bedside nurse who is already managing a full arrest and a fall risk and a patient screaming for water he is not allowed to drink. You triage the screams. You triage the fear. You triage your own humanity because if you stopped to feel every loss, you would not make it to lunch. I remember a colleague who cried in the supply closet. Not because of a death. Because she forgot to call a patient's daughter. The daughter had asked, specifically, to be updated after her father's procedure. The procedure went well. The father was stable, but my colleague had 7 other patients and 3 admissions and a manager who asked, gently, if she had considered picking up an extra shift. She forgot. She remembered at 9 p.m., driving home, and pulled over to cry in a CVS parking lot. The father was fine. The daughter would find out in the morning. No harm, strictly speaking. Just a crack in the covenant. Just another drop. This is how the bleed spreads. Not through malice. Through depletion. Through nurses who calculate ratios on scrap paper and doctors who stop introducing themselves because the name will be forgotten anyway and respiratory therapists who learn to whisper, I'll get to you when I can. We do not intend to harm. We simply run out. And running out, in a place built to hold the unthinkable, is the one failure the architects never planned for. The cathedral stands. The lights are on, but the people inside are pouring from an empty cup, and the cup will not refill itself. The invisible dead are not counted. Their names do not appear in morbidity and mortality reports. No root cause analysis is convened. No administrator stands before a whiteboard and maps the timeline of their final hours, because their final hours were never officially under our care. They died in the space between intake and admission. They died in the grammar of the system, in the loophole where a person is sick enough to come to the hospital but not sick enough to enter it. I saw a man die in the parking garage. Not on the helipad, not in the trauma bay. In the parking garage, on level 3, behind the wheel of a Honda Civic, because the chest pain started on his drive to the emergency department and the emergency department was full and he could not find a spot close enough. He parked. He walked. He collapsed 30 feet from the entrance. Security found him face down on the concrete, his keys still in his hand. He was 47. He had a wife. He had a job. He had insurance. He just did not have a bed. The invisible dead die in waiting rooms. Not the dramatic waiting rooms of television, where doctors sprint through double doors and families clutch each other in grief. They die in the hard plastic chairs designed to discourage loitering. They die under the muted television playing cable news. They die with a clipboard on their lap, the intake form half filled, the pen still uncapped. They die while the triage nurse is answering a phone. They die while a registrar enters their date of birth. They die while the person ahead of them describes, in exhaustive detail, the cough that has lasted 3 weeks. I watched a woman die in the hallway. She was 82. She was confused. She was placed on a gurney outside room 14 because room 14 was occupied and room 16 was being cleaned in. The emergency department had been on diversion for 6 hours. Her daughter stood beside her, holding her hand, asking every nurse who passed if someone could please just check her mother's blood pressure. The nurses were kind. The nurses were apologetic. The nurses were already assigned to 12 patients each and the patient in room 14 was crashing and the patient in room 16 had just arrived in the hallway. The hallway was where you put people who were not dying yet. Except she was. She was dying. She just was not doing it loudly enough to trigger the response. The invisible dead die in the radiology waiting area while waiting for a CT that was ordered 3 hours ago. They die on the bench outside the pharmacy while a prescription is processed. They die in the bathroom stall, alone, because the dizziness they reported to the front desk was triaged as non-urgent and they did not want to make a scene. They die in the ambulance bay, still on the stretcher, because the emergency department cannot accept a transfer and the paramedics have been holding the wall for 90 minutes and the monitor is showing a rhythm that no longer supports life. We do not call these deaths what they are. We call them delays. We call them throughput issues. We call them unfortunate outcomes in the context of system overload. We assign them to no one and therefore to everyone, which is the same as assigning them to no one at all. The man in the parking garage is not a sentinel event. The woman in the hallway is not a quality metric. The invisible dead do not generate data. They generate absence. They generate a daughter who will never again walk past a hospital without remembering her mother's last hour, spent in a corridor, waiting for a room that would not come. I do not know how many of them I saw. I stopped counting, not because I stopped caring, but because counting requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires action, and action requires the belief that the system can change. Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing. And that, perhaps, is the most invisible death of all. The desensitized do not look away. That is the deception. They do not flinch, do not grimace, do not turn their heads. They look directly at the wound, the bleed, the cardiac rhythm dissolving into asystole, and their faces hold nothing. Not callousness, not cruelty, just the eerie stillness of a lake that has frozen solid. I became desensitized on a Wednesday. I do not remember which Wednesday. I remember the patient was young, younger than me, and his chest had been opened in the trauma bay and the surgeon's hands were inside him and the blood was the same temperature as my own. I stood at the foot of the bed and I felt nothing. Not fear, not grief, not the urgent pull of investment. I was present. I performed my role. I anticipated the next intervention. But the space behind my sternum, where the horror should have lived, was quiet. The lake had frozen. This is not a confession. This is a warning. The desensitized are not monsters. They are the nurse who works her third consecutive shift and no longer hears the monitors as individual voices, only a collective hum. She still responds to alarms, still titrates the drips, still documents her assessments. But she no longer startles when the tone changes. The adrenaline no longer rises. The body has learned that the body cannot sustain emergency mode indefinitely, and so it negotiates a truce. The heart slows. The breath deepens. The mind cordons off the emotional district and declares it a no-fly zone. I watched a resident eat a granola bar while coding a patient. Not in the corner, not with his back turned. At the bedside, between compressions, while the charge nurse called time and the pharmacist drew up epinephrine. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. He resumed compressions. No one commented. No one judged. We understood. He had not eaten in 11 hours. The body requires fuel. The patient required CPR. Both things could be true simultaneously. Both things were happening in the same room, at the same table, under the same fluorescent light. The extraordinary had become ordinary. The sacred had become procedural. The desensitized develop rituals. They stop introducing themselves to patients because the name will be forgotten and the handshake takes 3 seconds they do not have. They stop attending funerals. They stop reading sympathy cards left on the nurse's station counter. They stop saying, "I'm sorry," and start saying, "I'm here." The language contracts. The emotional vocabulary shrinks to words that can be spoken without breaking. Stable, critical, deceased. 4 syllables. No room for grief. I remember a code called on a newborn. Tiny chest, tiny compressions, tiny doses draw.